Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Eladen semi-anaerobic wash process Peru from Langora Kaffe. And there's the bag right there. And Langora, based out of Stjørdal, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before, including last year during our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. And before that, we did a full bag review of one of their coffees. And before that, they featured in our first ever Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. And they're a coffee roaster that I have very much enjoyed in the past. One kind of interesting note about their current offerings is that this is the only non-natural or anaerobic natural processed coffee that they were offering. So it's the one I went with, as I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the natural that we did have from Langora last year, and this one felt like the more safe option. So I'm looking forward to discussing it, as it's still definitely different from anything we've had from Langora before. This right here is day 29. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 208 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Langora definitely roasts on the lighter side of things, as they are a Nordic coffee roaster. This one I wouldn't say was necessarily overly light, but just definitely more on the lighter side of things in general. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 13, first impression, and it was definitely a little early drinking this coffee. I felt like this one probably needed even more extended of a rest, as there was a somewhat tame cup with this slightly citric background and this somewhat papery aspect to the cup right at the forefront. And that's something I've experienced with plenty of other anaerobic wash processed coffees, is that they have this slight kind of papery quality to them, especially really early after the coffee has been roasted. So it came out a lot more tame than expected, not necessarily what I was expecting. But we continue on to day 15, as it still lacks an overly defined characteristic. It does cool off into this kind of citric background, but yet again it has a little bit more of that papery taste. More to the cup as it does cool, as the citrus really seems to open up, and it does get better as the cup does cool down. Day 17, still struggling to get much out of the cup aside from this kind of papery citric aspect that has been really consistent in these earlier days. It's quite tame yet again, with this secondary tropical cup accentuated by the abundance of lime. So that was really distinct. The lime at this point was really starting to take shape and become the most prominent factor in it. Caramel aspect was starting to make its presence felt. It was a little bit more slight and in the background, very much more in the finish, all secondary to this much more distinct and dominant lime. Day 19, starting to see the cup liven up as it's skewing a little bit more in the brown candy direction. So I believe that they have a caramel flavor note listed on here. I think that's probably what the caramel that they have listed there is. But still this slightly lime citric on the forefront, and within the mouthfeel itself, starting to get a little bit more stone fruit, starting to get a little bit more depth. This cup of coffee is starting to open up, and I still felt like maybe some adjustments might really help this coffee, as getting a little bit more sweetness in the finish as well. Day 21, ramped up the temperatures. That's the first big adjustment I made, and I feel like it really did help bring out a lot more in this coffee, as the caramel started to become the more dominant aspect at this time. So while the lime really dominated the cup in the earlier days, I was really enjoying this kind of darker sense to this coffee in general. As the citric lime started becoming the secondary factor, it was still strong in the finish itself, but it kind of encompassed a little bit more lively of this brown candy component to it. More of the stone fruits as well, a little bit tame still, but a better cup overall. Day 23, it continues to get better with age and with the increase in temperatures, so I feel like I understand that this coffee probably needed maybe another week, maybe even 2 weeks of rest to really get this coffee to start going, but it has this slight kind of kiwi-like aspect to it. The stone fruit is present yet again, and the entire cup still feels moderately tame, but at least I'm able to get some really nice brown candied sweetness from it. Lime on the forefront, but the cup is continuing to improve. It's improving in such small doses, though. It's not necessarily seeing a huge jump from day to day. It's just ever so slightly sweeter, with like a 1%, 2% increase in the overall sweetness with each day. Day 25, continuing to see that ever so slight improvement, as the sweetness to this point has become very much that deep brown candy, which I was really looking for. That's by far the best aspect of this coffee for me. Cup still bright on the forefront, does finish exceptionally well into that deep candied aspect, so much better. Definitely enjoying this coffee more. Here on day 29, I'm continuing to see an increase in that. It's definitely continuing to dissipate in terms of that slightly papery quality, as well as that citric aspect, and a lot more in terms of that brown candy component. Day 27, cup continuing to improve one last time, as the most prominent aspect of this cup has definitely become the caramel, which is a huge selling point to me. Early tropical papery taste has somewhat dissipated, and the citrus is much more secondary now, a little bit more distance between the lime and brown candy. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And a lot of level 4, so let's go through those real quick. Let's start with the cleanliness, level 4, because that's probably the best takeaway I have from this coffee is anaerobic wash processed coffees are definitely a lot cleaner than even natural processed coffees, and sometimes even honey processed coffees. So it's still a very clean cup of coffee, and that's probably the biggest takeaway I want to have for this coffee. Was just because something says anaerobic, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lack clarity. This one right here was a little tame, and it still had a fair bit of clarity to it. So that's not necessarily going to automatically make this coffee something that's overly sweet and overly lasting while losing out on all the clarity. So cleanliness, level 4, definitely agree with that. Acidity, level 4, yeah, it still wasn't necessarily overly acidic, so I think it just kind of reached that level 4 mark, but even then it was still on the slightly lower side of that level 4. Citrus fruit, level 4, at times the most dominant factor in this coffee, but definitely with time it has become more secondary. On the earlier days, even then, it was still never necessarily the most citric forward cup of coffee. So no point would I ever say it was higher than that level 4. Caramel, level 4, again, I feel like what's tricky about this tasting wheel is this is all relative. So in another coffee, this is maybe a level 3 for the citrus, maybe a level 3 for the caramel, but since there wasn't really too much else in this coffee in terms of really strong components, I feel like the caramel justified its mark at that level 4. Even if at its best, it was probably still just maybe on the moderate side of the level 4 and most of the time on the lower side of level 4. So I could see it even if it wasn't necessarily always there. Bunch of level 3s, body level 3. Yeah, especially with the V60, I feel like that's kind of a good fit for it. Had a nice bit of body to the cup as well. Finish, level 3. I think this is kind of where you can really put a tasting wheel all together and maybe get a good impression of how this coffee was. It really had a short finish to it, not really necessarily the most lasting, strong, or distinct finish, even with a citric component to it. So that's kind of interesting. I think it really does speak to the tame aspect of this coffee, and that's where the sweetness there at the level 3 mark also just kind of goes to show that at no point would I say any of the really sweeter characteristics were overly strong, overly defined, overly pronounced. And yet again, I want to give them credit. Maybe another week, maybe another even 2 weeks, this cup might have really opened up and we might have been able to get a lot more of that. Berry fruit, level 3, I did briefly mention that there's this kind of kiwi aspect to it. There's this slightly tropical aspect to it. So I could see that there. Again, all relative. Most other coffees, this would still be on the lower side of things. It's a little bit more subtle in addition to that stone fruit, which at times I felt a slight apricot sort of component to it, which also a little bit more subtle. In most other cups of coffee, it might not even necessarily be overly noticeable. But given that this coffee never had an overly strong component to it, I feel like those could be justified at that level 3 mark. Couple of level 2s, I don't think any of them are necessarily worth discussing. I actually quite like the way that this tasting wheel looks. I think it's a pretty accurate representation of what I got for the most part during this coffee. I don't think it really changed much throughout the time drinking it. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I thought it was fine, and I will continue to say that this coffee continues to improve. So I just imagine that in another week, and I have 1 cup of this coffee left, so I'll probably re-explore it in another week or 10 days or something like that and see if it might have finally opened up. But for the most part, I always say I want the sweetness to be at a level 4 to really start the conversation of maybe enjoying a cup of coffee. And this one didn't necessarily have the sweetness I was looking for. It was a little bit more tame than what I was looking for, and none of the factors I was really hoping would be accentuated within this cup were necessarily there. The brown candy was really nice. By far my favorite aspect within this coffee, and I've never been the biggest fan of citric coffees in general. So I thought this one was fine. I appreciate the fact that it was cleaner in general, and that's pretty much the best you can ask for when you're looking for something on the more experimental side of things. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I'm starting to think that maybe there is a little bit of a niche for people that do enjoy the washed anaerobics, because they are a little different. Oftentimes they can come out a little bit more tame. I'm mostly thinking of the coffee that we reviewed from Blind Tiger, the first one. I believe it was an Isias Fernandez, which at times came out a little too tame, and I heard that after a while it really started to open up. But for the most part, it was super delicate, and nothing in this cup was overly pronounced. What I can say is those 2 factors, the citrus and the lime, in a more clean cup can make a really nice balance if you are a big fan of those 2 components. For For the most part though, I think I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Eliden semi-anaerobic wash process Peru from Langora Kaffe. Thank you for watching.